Welcome to our review of comparison and contrast essays, particularly in the UIM context. Comparison and contrast are some of the most basic types of essays that you can use. They're also some of the most useful. No matter where you go outside of the university, especially if you go into business, you might be doing some form or fashion of comparison and contrast. So it's definitely something worth paying attention to. If it helps, think of comparison and contrast as similarities and dissimilarities. What you're doing is you're taking two basic issues, sometimes more than two depending on the context, but for our purposes you're taking two basic issues and you're identifying either three similarities between the two or three dissimilarities. And we're going to come back to this, but for your exam essay it's important that you stick to either doing comparison or similarities, or you choose to do contrast or dissimilarities. Don't do both. Well, there are several larger purposes to such an essay. They demonstrate how one thing may be superior to another. This is a thing one versus thing two. You might use that in a business context. If someone asks you to decide which of these routes is the best one to take, or which item should you purchase. To identify and clarify common misunderstandings, you can compare a mistake versus the truth. So dispelling bad ideas is a purpose of comparison and contrast. To provide a new way of doing or understanding something, this is the old way of doing it compared to the new way of doing it or contrasted to the new way of doing it. To state, elaborate, or discuss something that is unknown, and that may seem kind of strange for comparison and contrast, but this is kind of a metaphorical approach where you take something that the reader knows and you compare it to something that is unknown, or again, you contrast it. So you say it's like this, like this, like this, like that, or of course, contrast, different. Now again, you will not be comparing and contrasting in the same essay. Do one or the other. I'm going to sound like the proverbial broken record on that point, but it's very important. So when you compare, you talk about how the two things are the same. When you contrast, you talk about how the two things are different. So again, similarities or dissimilarities. As with most types of essays, there are various ways to accomplish your goal. Now, when you're working on your exams, they're looking for you to use one particular tested style. But I'm going to go ahead and talk about one of the other more common styles because you're very likely to encounter it elsewhere, particularly on the internet. And that style is the block analysis style. And we have an outline for a block analysis style essay here. So first you have your introduction. You introduce the main topic. You give the specific topic. You give the items you will compare or contrast. You give your thesis statement and you give your plan of development. Then, when you get into your body paragraphs, first you discuss and describe the details of item 1. Now, there's no actual comparisons being made in body paragraph 1 in this style. You're just acquainting us. You're letting us get to know all of the details of item 1. Then, when you transition into body paragraph 2, you discuss and describe the details of item 2. Again, you're not going to go back and mention item 1 or make any explicit comparisons or contrasts. You're just going to say, this is item 2. This is all the details of item 2. Then when you get into body paragraph 3, this is where the work begins. You transition and you concisely start drawing those explicit comparison and contrasts or contrasts between items 1 and 2, and you explain the significance and the implications, basically what it all means. So body paragraph 1, this is all the details of item 1. Body paragraph 2, here are all the details of number 2. And then body paragraph 3, here's all of the comparison and contrast. Here's all of how the details relate. And of course, it's very important. I can tell you that when I grade essays outside of UIM, I see a lot of this type of analysis style. And a big problem that I see is people will do basically body paragraph 1, they'll describe points 1 or item 1, they'll do body paragraph 2, they'll describe item 2, and then they just stop. They basically leave the reader to do all of the figuring out. And I guess when you think you see it, it seems obvious to you to say here is A and here is B. Surely the reader can pick up on that. Well, you'd like to think so. But it's your job as the essay writer to make those connections. You have to actually do the work, draw out the conclusions, and we have to be able to see the results. So if by chance, somewhere other than here, you go to write this type of block style analysis, make sure you get those explicit, detailed comparison and contrasts in there. And then, of course, you end with your summary, your restatement of the thesis, you give your parting shot. Now, again, while this is common, this is not the organization that your examiners will be looking for. They're going to want something else. All right, so the style that they're going to be looking for on your exam is the point-by-point comparison or contrast. And of course, they need to have some kind of basic standard. You want them to have some kind of basic standard, so you'll know what to expect, and they'll know what to expect, and everybody will have a fair chance to understand what's actually happening on this exam. So the point-by-point is a little bit different than the block style. The introduction is going to look kind of similar. You introduce the main topic, you get the specific topic, the items that you're going to compare and contrast, sort of give us that background info. You then give your thesis statement and plan of development. So comparison or contrast 1, comparison and contrast 2, comparison or contrast 3. And then, again, remember, compare or contrast, do not do both. Then you jump into the body paragraphs. Now, the body paragraphs are all going to basically take, instead of one item for comparison, they're going to take one comparison itself. So you transition, you give a topic sentence outlining a similarity or dissimilarity between the two items. Supporting sentence 1 describes item 1, supporting sentence 2 describes item 2. You give an explanation that draws out the comparison or contrast, and then you transition into body paragraph 2. Same thing for body paragraph 3. Then in your conclusion, once again, you transition, you summarize, you restate the thesis, and you give a parting shot. All right, so here's an idea of what it might look like. So starting out with the thesis or plan of development, this is one I made up off the top of my head. Star Wars differs from Star Trek in its tone, use of different philosophies, and disregard for known science. And so, of course, we're going to be doing the contrast angle as opposed to the comparison. And we're going to look at one set of contrasts per body paragraph. So body paragraph 1, first we look at the tone. And of course, remember, it's very important. Organize your body paragraphs in the same order that you deal with them in your POD for the exam. Star Wars has a grand, freewheeling sort of ambiance, while Star Trek promotes a more serious utopian approach. And so your first sentence on that, you might say Star Wars is basically a space western, whereas Star Trek is an idealistic vision of the future. It takes itself very seriously sometimes. Body paragraph 2, talk about philosophies. On the one hand, Star Wars draws heavily from Eastern philosophy, but Star Trek is essentially secular humanist. So Star Wars, Buddhism. Star Trek, 20th century Enlightenment materialism. Topic sentence for body paragraph 3 maybe, on science. While Star Wars routinely ignores physics, Star Trek attempts to explain everything using some known scientific law. So for Star Wars, all you have to say is space swords of coherent light, which defy just about everything we know about physics. Star Trek, on the other hand, is so specific that if you're enough of a Trekkie to know this, they have something called the Heisenberg compensator. I won't go into that. But they try to go through and explain how everything suddenly works or is supposed to according to the known laws of physics. And so then you add your conclusion. Hopefully, you'll see how this all plays out together. This is what an essay might look like for your exam. I hope it's helpful.